I'd like to introduce you to the Camera+2 app. After downloading it, you can find it on your phone by looking for that little rainbow circle. And when you open it up, it starts to look like your regular phone app, camera app might look. But it's got some extra features which are real nice. So first off, let's just kind of look around at what are all the different things. Now I've got this organized according to landscape orientation, which means it's horizontal. It just kind of reorients itself when it's portrait orientation, which is vertical. You should choose the orientation that is best for the picture that you want. But for now, since this works best with video, that's what I've got. Over on the far right, that big button is the button that takes the picture. If I click the plus option, so the whole thing with Camera Plus is that every time you click the plus, a new option opens up. So if I click the plus option, I get some interesting options for how how the camera will take the picture. So the normal option just means it immediately takes the picture and it takes one picture at a time. Right above it is burst, which means if I hold down, it's taking a bunch of pictures all at once. So if you're taking a picture of something moving, burst is actually kind of nice because then you can it takes a lot of pictures really quickly. You can pick your best picture. There's the timer option, so if you want to be, right now it's on a 10-second timer. And then down here, I'm going to ignore the smile option. I believe it waits for the best smile, but the stabilizer option is nice. If you are kind of moving around, I click the button and then it says hold steady to take photo, and then it takes the photo when it kind of realizes you're steady. So it gives you a little chance to like stabilize after you've clicked the button. It's kind of like timer, but just a little bit quicker. So I'm gonna go back to normal for now. You'll notice that below the shutter release button, that big take the picture button, is you get that kind of flower looking. So that's where you find, they call it the light box, that's where you find all the pictures that you took. So you can see I've got one picture that has 11 photos, that's the burst I took. But I'm gonna click on that camera icon to go back to camera. So that's where you can see it. If I keep moving over, I have this slider that is my exposure compensation slider. So we talked about, forcing the picture to go but lighter or forcing the picture to go darker. That's where I can do it. That's called exposure compensation. Okay, moving over is where I can see what I'm actually taking pictures of. So just like your normal phone camera app, if I tap on the area that I want to emphasize, I'm gonna set my focus and my exposure there. So right now it's on the flowers in the front. If I can set it on the flowers in the background, you'll notice that the exposure got a little darker. If I move it over here to these flowers, the exposure sort of resets itself. So I'm setting my focus and exposure. What's really nice about the Camera+2 app is if I hit that plus button, I'm separating out focus and exposure because I want my focus on those flowers, but I can adjust my exposure. Notice if I set it in a darker area, the exposure gets lighter. If I set it in a lighter area, the exposure gets darker. So I can kind of choose where I want to set my exposure to get because sometimes the focus and exposure, you don't actually want those set in the same area. So that gives you a lot more control. Again, with exposure, you can still do exposure compensation and you can move the exposure around. So if I zoom in, I can make sure my focus is exactly where I want it to be. I can brighten that up, do that, move it around. Okay, that seems like a good exposure, and then take my picture. You'll notice that the picture that we're looking at has a grid on it. Right now it's showing me the rule of thirds. There are some other options I can put on my screen that can be helpful for taking a picture. So if you look over on the left, the icon on the bottom, it looks like some sliders. So there are some different things that I can choose. So right now I have the grid on, I have zoom on. Let's say I want to take that off because digital zoom is bad. I can also pick timestamp and geotag, so that's some metadata that can get embedded in the photo. A level tells me, so if you see, if I tip it, it's telling me I'm angling my photo. So if you're trying to create a level photo, that can be really helpful. And then some other options, focus, peaking, and clipping, we'll talk about a little bit later on. But this thing just shows you what are the options on my screen. Right above that is flash control. So you have auto flash, off, on, or torch. So torch means like it's constantly on, which can be really nice. And then above that is where your camera modes are. So your options are auto, portrait, which can do some weird blurriness, but experiment with how these work. Slow shutter speed, action shutter speed, macro. Don't worry about taking camera raw pictures, and then manual mode. With manual mode, you get some different options. We'll talk about these a little bit more in weeks 4 and 5. So unless you're familiar with manual controls, for now, you can stick around in auto or experiment with these other camera modes. Moving up to that other icon above where the camera modes are, if I click that, this gives me different ratios. So normal is great. I would say stick with normal unless you have a reason for doing one of the other ones. Normal just means it's a normal picture ratio, and that's always good to stick with. Square is, if you're familiar with Instagram, square can be nice if you're aiming for a location that needs a square picture. And then 16:9 is actually widescreen, so if you're taking a video, although we're not going to worry about that in this class or this app, but if you were taking pictures that were aimed at a video, taking in this format could be really nice. And then right above that is flip around to see yourself. We don't need to do that. So those are all the different bits and bobs in your, I'm going to move back to normal orientation, or normal ratio. Those are kind of what's going on in your Camera+ app. I always recommend just play around, see what happens when you change things. The more comfortable you are, the better pictures you're going to take.